Mark came home after spending 2 weeks with the woman he had once planned to marry. He stepped into the kitchen with his suitcase in one hand and a strange calmness on his face. Not guilt. Not fear. Relief. Laura had not seen him look that peaceful in years. He set the suitcase near the door and told her the trip had given him clarity. He said he had finally made peace with the past. Rebecca was part of another life, and now that chapter was closed. He said he wanted to save their marriage. Then he looked Laura in the eyes and gave her the sentence he must have practiced all the way home. I know what I want now. Laura did not ask if they had shared a room. She did not ask if he had kissed Rebecca, slept beside her, or woken up with her every morning for 2 weeks. She did not even ask if he still loved her. Laura simply stood there and let Mark talk. He talked about counseling, forgiveness, rebuilding trust. He talked about the fresh start he believed they could still have, as though he had only taken a wrong turn and not stepped outside their marriage to see if another life suited him better. After dinner, Laura carried his plate to the sink. Then, without raising her voice, she asked him one question. If Rebecca had asked you to stay, would you still be standing in this kitchen? Mark went completely still. For one long second, he seemed to forget how to breathe. He did not look at his wife. He did not say yes. He did not say no. Then his phone lit up on the table. A message from Rebecca appeared across the screen. I told you I need more time. That was all Laura needed to see. Subscribe for more stories where betrayal leaves evidence. Because before Mark came home claiming he had chosen his family, Laura had already found the first payment for the life he planned without them. 2 months earlier. Laura Bennett would have called her marriage steady. Not perfect. Certainly not as romantic as it had been when she and Mark were younger. But steady. They had been married for 24 years. They lived in a comfortable house outside the city. The kind of place filled with old furniture, family photographs, and repairs that were always going to be handled next weekend. The mortgage was almost paid off. Their daughter, Sophie, was 15. She was old enough to notice when her parents were tense, but still young enough to rely on the routines Laura worked hard to protect. Mark traveled often for work. Laura kept the rest of their life running. She filled out school forms, scheduled doctor visits, remembered prescription refills, bought groceries, paid utility bills, and called repairmen whenever Mark said he would handle something, but never quite found the time. They had retirement accounts, a shared savings account, a home equity line they had opened several years earlier during a kitchen renovation. They almost never touched it anymore. Mark earned more than Laura. His salary was good, and his commissions and annual bonuses had allowed them to live comfortably. But Laura understood their finances. She knew what came into the house. She knew what went out. She knew how much they could spend without worrying, and how much would put pressure on everything else. Over the years, their conversations had become practical. They talked about Sophie's school schedule, property taxes, grocery lists, a dripping faucet, Mark's next flight, whether the car needed new tires. Some nights, they sat in the same room for hours and barely spoke. Laura noticed the distance. She was not the kind of woman who pretended her marriage was perfect simply because it had lasted a long time. She knew she had been tired. She knew there were evenings when she answered work emails in bed instead of talking to Mark. There were weekends when errands replaced dinners out. Months when parenting, bills, and responsibilities seemed to take up every available space. Sometimes Laura and Mark felt less like husband and wife, and more like two dependable people managing the same household. Still, she did not believe their marriage was broken. Comfort was not the same thing as failure. A quiet marriage was not necessarily an empty one. At least, that was what Laura believed before Rebecca Hale came back into their lives. Mark mentioned her casually one evening over dinner. Rebecca had contacted him through social media. She was going through a divorce and had started reaching out to people she remembered from her younger years. Rebecca was not just an old friend. She was the woman Mark had loved before Laura. The woman he had once talked about marrying. At first, there were only a few messages. Rebecca asked about people they used to know. Mark asked how she was handling the divorce. They traded memories about old restaurants, long-forgotten friends, and places they had visited in their 20s. Mark told Laura about enough of those conversations to make them seem harmless. That was important. People tend to trust what appears to be openness. Sometimes the easiest way to hide something is to reveal just enough of it. Laura did not object. She did not want to become the suspicious wife who inspected every message or treated every woman from Mark's past as a threat. When she asked him whether the contact felt strange, Mark smiled. "Rebecca belongs to another lifetime," he said. Laura believed him. Or at least, she wanted to. The first time Laura became uncomfortable, Mark did not start hiding Rebecca. He did something more effective. He made Laura feel unreasonable for noticing her. Within 2 weeks, Rebecca's messages had become part of their daily life. Mark's phone lit up during dinner. It buzzed beside him while they watched television. Sometimes Laura woke in the middle of the night and saw the pale light from the screen across his face. Then he started placing the phone face down, and he started smiling at it. It was a private kind of smile. Softer. Younger. Laura remembered seeing that expression during the first years of their own marriage, when she asked what Rebecca needed so late at night. Mark always had an answer. Rebecca was struggling. The divorce had left her isolated. She did not have many people she trusted. Mark understood who she had been before her marriage, before the disappointments, before her life became complicated. At first, he had only been responding to messages. Soon, he had become the person Rebecca depended on. Mark said their shared history made certain conversations easier. He said she needed someone who would listen without judging her. He said he was only helping an old friend through a painful time. Laura told him the constant contact made her uncomfortable. Mark did not apologize. Instead, he looked wounded. "Do you trust me or not?" That question shifted the entire argument. Suddenly, they were no longer discussing whether Mark had crossed a boundary with another woman. They were discussing Laura's jealousy, her insecurity, her apparent inability to trust the man she had been married to for 24 years. Laura backed down. She told herself she did not want to overreact. That was exactly what Mark needed. After that, Rebecca began showing up in more of his conversations. Mark talked about places they had visited together. He remembered music they used to listen to. He described the way Rebecca had understood him when they were young. He began saying there were parts of his life Laura could never fully understand because she had not known him then. Then came the unfinished questions. Mark never said he planned to leave. He never said he wanted Rebecca back. He said he needed to understand himself. The request came on a Sunday evening. Rebecca wanted to return to a coastal town where she and Mark had spent time before their relationship ended. Mark explained that the two of them needed to talk. They needed to revisit the past and finally close a chapter that had never ended properly. At first, he said it would only be a few days. Then it became a week. By the time the flights were booked, the trip had grown to 14 nights. Laura looked at him and asked the obvious question. Why did closure require 2 full weeks? Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to know whether what I'm feeling is real or only nostalgia. That was the moment Laura understood what the trip actually was. Mark was not going there to bury the past. He was going there to see whether it still had a future. Laura told him it sounded like an emotional affair. Mark shook his head. You're deciding what happened before anything has happened. But something had already happened. Mark had asked his wife to accept the betrayal before it was complete, and then accused her of being distrustful because she recognized it. 3 days later, he left. Laura did not argue with him at the airport. She did not threaten to change the locks or call a lawyer before he reached the gate. She did not contact Rebecca. She did not write angry messages or post the story online. Laura hugged Sophie before school, went to work, came home, made dinner, and kept their household moving. For the first 2 days, Mark sent brief updates. The weather was nice, the town had changed. He and Rebecca were having good conversations. Nothing more. Then, less than 48 hours after Mark left, Laura received an alert from their joint bank account. A large transfer had been made. $12,800. The money had gone to a company called North Harbor Property Management. Laura stared at the screen. Mark had told her the travel expenses were being split equally. He said he was only paying for his airfare, meals, and half the rental cost. $12,800 was not half of a vacation. Laura opened the joint account they had used throughout their marriage. She did not guess a password. She did not break into Mark's email or search his phone. Her name was on the account. The money belonged to both of them. She had every right to see where it had gone. The transfer was not the first one. 6 weeks earlier, Mark had sent $3,200 to the same company. The description included 2 words: security deposit. Another payment for $1,850 was labeled furnishing. Laura kept looking. She found restaurant charges, a hotel deposit, 2 smaller transfers, All of them had appeared before Mark ever mentioned taking a trip with Rebecca. That was what frightened her most. The paper trail had started before the story he gave her. Laura called North Harbor Property Management. She gave her name and explained that the money had come from an account she jointly owned. She asked what kind of expense the transfer covered. The employee refused to name the tenant or discuss any lease details. Laura did not pressure her. Before ending the call, the employee confirmed one thing. The payment was connected to a residential property, not a hotel, not a vacation rental, a condo. Laura sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the bank statement, while Mark's harmless little travel messages remained open beside it. Maybe he had not gone away merely to revisit an old relationship. Maybe he had already prepared somewhere to live in case Rebecca asked him to stay. Every part of Laura wanted to call him. She wanted to demand an explanation. She wanted to force him to answer before he had one more night to enjoy the life he was quietly testing. Then she remembered how easily Mark had turned every concern against her. If she confronted him now, he would explain the transfers away. He might move the remaining money. He might clean up the records or return home with a better story. Laura had evidence, but she did not have the whole truth. So she did the hardest thing she could have done. She waited. Laura downloaded the joint bank statements, the shared credit card records, the home equity documents, their recent tax returns. Nothing was stolen. Nothing came from a private account she had no right to enter. These were records connected to property and money that belonged to both of them. She saved every document inside a new folder. Laura did not name it affair. She named it Household Records. Pain had given her plenty of questions. Now she needed facts. And unlike Mark's explanations, facts had a way of surviving rehearsal. Mark came home 2 weeks after he left with Rebecca. He looked rested. Not happy exactly, just settled, as though the hardest part of the whole situation had already happened somewhere far away. And now all he had to do was explain it well enough for Laura to accept. He brought his suitcase into the kitchen and left it beside the wall. Then he began talking. He said the trip had helped him understand what he had been feeling. Rebecca represented his past. The memories had been powerful, but memories were not the same as a life. Laura and Sophie were his real life. They were the people who mattered. He said he wanted marriage counseling. He wanted to rebuild trust. He believed the two of them could come through this stronger if they were both willing to be honest. Laura listened without interrupting. She did not mention North Harbor Property Management. She did not mention the $12,800. She did not tell him about the earlier security deposit, the furnishing payment, or the condo connected to their joint account. She said nothing about the statements she had saved while he was gone. Mark mistook her silence for uncertainty. He thought she was still trying to decide whether she believed him. In truth, Laura was giving him room to reveal how much of the story he had already prepared. They ate dinner at the kitchen table. Mark spoke carefully. He said people sometimes had to face the past before they could appreciate the present. He admitted the trip had been selfish, but he framed that selfishness as something almost necessary. He said he had needed clarity. He said he had come home with it. Then he started talking about forgiveness. That was when Laura understood how he expected this to go. He wanted the trip to become a painful chapter they could eventually look back on together. He wanted counseling to turn his choices into a shared marital problem. He wanted Laura to help him repair the damage he had created while he still controlled how much of the truth she was allowed to know. Laura carried the plates to the sink. Mark kept talking behind her. He said they could start fresh. Laura turned around. Her voice was quiet when she asked him the question. If Rebecca had asked you to stay, would you still be standing in this kitchen? Mark stopped moving. He looked as though the question had reached him before he could put his defenses in place. He did not answer. He did not even look at Laura. Then his phone lit up on the table. Rebecca's name appeared on the screen. The message beneath it was short. I told you, I need time. Laura read it from where she stood. Mark reached for the phone too late. The room went silent. Laura did not demand to read the rest of the conversation. She did not ask whether Rebecca had rejected him. She did not ask what promise he had made to her before coming home. The message had already answered the part that mattered. Mark had not returned because he had made a clear and wholehearted choice. He had returned because Rebecca had not made hers. His marriage was still available. The woman from his past was not. Laura looked at the man she had been married to for 24 years and realized he had come home expecting gratitude for returning to the place he had kept as a backup. She did not scream. That seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. Mark began explaining the message. He said Rebecca was emotional. Her divorce was still complicated. She did not know what she wanted. Laura listened. Each sentence only made the truth clearer. Rebecca needed time. Mark needed somewhere to wait. Laura refused to become that place. The next morning, she called work and said she would be late. Then she drove to a family law office, 20 minutes from home. The attorney was a woman named Elaine Carter. She was in her late 50s and spoke without drama. That helped. Laura had spent weeks being told she was emotional, suspicious, and insecure. Elaine did not ask her to calm down. She did not tell her to fight. She asked Laura to explain what had happened in order: the messages, the trip, the bank transfer, the condo. The question Mark could not answer. Elaine listened and took notes. When Laura finished, she did not promise that Mark would lose everything. She did not say a judge would punish him for sleeping with another woman. She did not offer Laura the kind of courtroom revenge people imagine when they are still in shock. Instead, she explained what might actually matter. According to Elaine, in their state, the financial records could become important if marital money had been diverted, income had been concealed, or future custody claims did not match the family's real parenting history. Then she began asking questions that had little to do with romance. Whose names were on the bank accounts? Had the balance on the home equity line changed? How was Mark paid? Was his income limited to salary, or did he receive commissions and bonuses? Who scheduled Sophie's medical appointments? Who communicated with her teachers? Who stayed home when she was sick? How often was Mark away for work? Had he already established another residence? Laura answered as carefully as she could. By the end of the meeting, she understood something that had not occurred to her before. The betrayal and the divorce were connected, but they were not the same case. The betrayal explained why the marriage was ending. The records would help determine what happened next. Elaine also gave Laura one instruction she took seriously. Do not make Sophie choose. Do not ask her to carry messages. Do not tell her details she was too young to process. Whatever Mark had done as a husband, Sophie still needed room to have a relationship with her father without feeling responsible for either parent's pain. Laura agreed. She did not want revenge through her daughter. She wanted stability for her. Over the next several days, Laura gathered the ordinary records of their family life. The school calendar, medical appointments, emergency contact forms, emails from teachers, activity schedules, Mark's work travel dates, the weekends he had missed and the events he had promised to attend but canceled. None of it looked dramatic. That was the point. Daily parenting rarely looks dramatic. It looks like remembering a permission slip, answering the school nurse, rearranging work when a child has a fever, driving across town for an appointment no one else remembered. Mark loved Sophie. Laura never denied that. But love and daily responsibility were not always divided equally. Laura had been the one holding most of those responsibilities for years. If Mark later claimed he had always done half, the calendar would tell a quieter and more accurate story. Money was more complicated. Mark had a solid base salary, but that was only one part of his income. There were quarterly commissions, an annual bonus, consulting payments that appeared irregularly. Their lifestyle had never been supported by salary alone. Elaine explained that if the case moved forward, formal financial discovery could be used to obtain a complete picture. Laura did not need to become a detective. She did not need to access private accounts or search for passwords. She only needed to preserve what she was legally entitled to see and let the legal process handle the rest. Laura went home and reviewed the financial records again. This time, she looked at them differently. The most recent bonus deposit was smaller than expected. Several commission payments she remembered Mark discussing had never appeared in their usual account. Then she noticed transfers involving an LLC called MHB Consulting Group. Mark had mentioned it before. He said the company used it to process outside consulting work and side projects. At the time, Laura had accepted the explanation. Now she recorded every date and every amount. She did not accuse him. She did not ask him to explain. She simply kept notes. 3 nights later, Mark went to bed early. Laura stayed downstairs and opened the shared folder where they kept tax records, insurance documents, and mortgage paperwork. She was looking for an old income statement. Instead, she found a PDF with a plain, forgettable file name. It was not a photograph of Mark and Rebecca. It was not a hotel reservation or a private message. It was an insurance quote for a condo The insured person was Mark Bennett. The address was the same one connected to North Harbor Property Management. Laura checked the effective date twice. The coverage had been scheduled to begin 3 weeks before Mark left on the trip. He had insured a residence he had never mentioned, a residence connected to payments taken from money they shared. Laura sat in front of the computer and felt the last of her uncertainty disappear. The trip itself had lasted 2 weeks. The planning had started long before that. For a while, Laura believed the condo might be the largest secret Mark had kept from her. She was wrong. Once the formal requests began, the financial records came in piece by piece. At first, they looked harmless. Commission statements, LLC records, utility deposits, furniture receipts, business transfers. Then Elaine's office arranged the dates in order. The pattern became difficult to ignore. Part of Mark's commission income had been directed through MHB Consulting Group instead of the joint accounts Laura knew. The condo deposit came from marital funds. Furniture had been purchased before the trip. Electricity and internet had been scheduled to begin shortly before Mark came home. This was not a man who had gone away, become overwhelmed by old feelings, and made one reckless mistake. This was preparation. The most damaging document was a spreadsheet. There was nothing emotional about it. No romantic language. No mention of love. Just columns, estimates, and totals. Condo expenses. Utilities. Insurance. Food. Mark's expected contribution toward the family mortgage. Projected legal costs. Projected child support. Laura read each line slowly. Mark had calculated how much money he would need if he moved out. He had estimated what maintaining 2 households would cost. He had compared that amount against his salary, commissions, and consulting income. At the top of the document were 3 words. Post-separation budget. Laura had expected photographs to hurt. She had expected messages to hurt. She had not expected a spreadsheet to feel so personal. A message could be written in a weak moment. A kiss could be explained as impulse. Even a trip could be blamed on confusion. But a budget required time. It required planning. It required a person to sit down more than once and decide whether abandoning his family was financially comfortable enough. Mark had not simply fallen back into an old relationship. He had studied the cost of replacing his current life with it. And while he was doing that, Laura was still paying bills, scheduling Sophie's appointments, and believing they were going through an ordinary, difficult season. The records also revealed something about Rebecca. She had not committed to the life Mark had built on paper. Her divorce was not finished. She wanted distance. She wanted time to decide what she was willing to risk. Mark had rented and furnished the condo before Rebecca had agreed to share it. He had planned further ahead than she had. When the trip ended, Rebecca would not promise him a future. So he came home and presented his return as devotion. Laura finally understood why his speech had sounded so polished. He had not returned because 2 weeks away had shown him the value of his wife. He had returned because the woman he wanted was not yet ready to receive him. For the next several weeks, Laura lived a life Mark did not understand. From the outside, very little changed. She went to work, she made dinner, she drove Sophie to school and picked her up after activities. She even attended one marriage counseling session with Mark. He sat beside her and described the trip as an identity crisis. He said he had lost himself. He said reconnecting with Rebecca had forced him to confront parts of his past. Laura listened while he turned months of financial planning into a period of emotional confusion. She did not correct every lie. She did not reveal every document. Privately, she worked with Elaine. She answered legal questions, reviewed household expenses, considered where she and Sophie might live if the house had to be sold. She made sure she still had lawful access to the accounts bearing her name. She calculated what she could afford on her own. Mark thought Laura was deciding whether to forgive him. Laura was deciding how to leave without allowing his choices to destroy the stability Sophie still had. The confrontation came on a Thursday night. Sophie was staying with a friend. Laura waited until dinner was over. Then she placed 3 documents on the kitchen table. The condo insurance quote, the transfer records, the post-separation budget. Mark looked down at them. For the first time since returning home, the confidence left his face. Laura sat across from him. When exactly did your closure trip become a housing plan? Mark picked up the insurance quote. He said she did not understand what she was looking at. He had only explored options. Nothing had been finalized. The spreadsheet was a private draft. People considered different possibilities all the time. Laura let him finish. Then she said, "Give me the context." Mark stared at the documents. He began one explanation and abandoned it halfway through. He tried another. There was no version of the story that made the dates innocent. The condo existed before the trip. The money had moved before the confession. The budget had been written while Laura still believed they were protecting the same future. Finally, Laura asked him another question. Did you come home because you chose this family? Or because the life you planned with Rebecca wasn't ready for you yet? Mark did not answer. Not directly. He talked about pressure, fear, confusion. He said everything had moved too quickly. He insisted he had never meant to hurt Sophie. Laura gathered the papers from the table. That is the second question you couldn't answer, she said. I only needed one. A single reckless night might be called a mistake. Months of payments, documents, and planning were something else. They were a pattern. Mark had spent months preparing to leave his family. What he had not prepared for was explaining those decisions once the numbers were placed in front of him. When the divorce papers arrived, Mark stopped talking about healing. He stopped asking Laura to give the marriage more time. He stopped saying the trip had only been about closure. The moment the situation moved from the kitchen table to a legal file, his tone changed. Now he was defending himself. His first major demand was equal parenting time. Mark said Sophie needed both parents. He said he had always been an involved father. He accused Laura of using the divorce to punish him and insisted that anything less than a 50-50 schedule would be unfair. Laura could have argued with him. She could have listed every missed school event, every canceled weekend, every time he had called from an airport and asked her to handle something he had promised to do. She did not. By then, she understood that arguments disappeared as soon as they ended. Records remained. Mark's travel calendar showed how often he had been out of town. School emails showed Laura as the parent-teachers contacted first. Medical forms carried her signature. Appointment records showed who took Sophie to the dentist, the doctor, and the counselor she had briefly seen during a difficult semester. Activity schedules showed who arranged transportation and who waited in parking lots after practice. None of those documents called Mark a bad father. Laura did not believe he was one. He loved Sophie. But there was a difference between loving a child and carrying the ordinary weight of raising one. Laura had carried most of that weight for years. She had remembered the deadlines, answered the late calls, rearranged her workday when Sophie was sick, stayed awake through fevers and school anxiety. Bought supplies Mark forgot, and attended meetings he could not fit around his travel schedule. Mark had participated when his work allowed it. That was not the same as equal day-to-day parenting. The records made that clear without Laura having to say a single cruel thing. The 2-week trip with Rebecca also appeared on the timeline. Mark had left during a period when Sophie was already struggling at school. Laura had asked him to postpone the trip. He had gone anyway. That did not mean he should lose his daughter. It did mean the parenting plan needed to reflect the life Sophie had actually been living, not the version Mark began presenting once child support became part of the conversation. Laura never asked Sophie where she wanted to live. She never told her to choose. When Sophie asked what was happening, Laura kept the explanation simple. The marriage was ending. Both parents loved her. None of it was her fault. The adults would handle the adult problems. Laura also made one rule clear. Sophie would not become a messenger. If Mark wanted to discuss the divorce, he could speak to Laura or the attorneys. He would not send questions through their daughter. Laura would not do that either. The legal process was already painful enough. A 15-year-old did not need to be recruited into it. Money became the next battlefield. Mark initially presented his income using his base salary. On paper, it looked respectable, but ordinary. It also made his support obligations look smaller. The consulting work, he claimed, was irregular. The commissions changed from year to year. The bonus was never guaranteed. Each statement was technically possible. Together, they created a picture that was incomplete. Formal financial discovery filled in the rest. Commission statements showed money Mark had not listed clearly. Bonus compensation appeared in company records. Payments connected to MHB Consulting Group showed that consulting income had been more consistent than he first claimed. Some of that money had remained outside the household accounts Laura knew. Elaine did not accuse Mark of stealing. She did not call him a criminal. That was never the strategy. She simply organized the records and presented the full picture of his income. Once the numbers were placed beside each other, Mark's version became difficult to defend. The family had not lived on his base salary alone. The condo had not been funded by his base salary alone. The life he had planned with Rebecca had depended on commissions, bonuses, consulting income, and money taken from accounts shared with his wife. Those same figures now mattered when support was calculated. For years, Mark had benefited from having a flexible income. Now the flexibility no longer allowed him to hide behind the smallest number. The condo payments also became part of the financial negotiations. The security deposit, the furniture, the utilities, the insurance, the large transfer from their joint account. Mark argued that the condo had been rented during a period of uncertainty. He said he had believed he might need temporary housing. But temporary housing did not explain a furnished residence prepared before the trip. It did not explain the post-separation budget, and did not explain why he had estimated future child support before ever telling Laura he was considering leaving. That spreadsheet followed him through every financial conversation. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The document showed that Mark had expected to preserve the marriage long enough to decide whether the alternative was affordable. He had calculated the cost of leaving. What he had not calculated was the cost of being discovered before he could control the timing. The condo slowly changed from a symbol of freedom into a monthly burden. There was rent, insurance, utilities, furniture debt, legal fees, support obligations. Mark had planned for some of those expenses. He had not planned for all of them to arrive at once. He had also assumed the house would remain stable while he tested another life. Instead, the house had to be addressed as part of the divorce. The mortgage was nearly paid off, which meant the equity mattered. Laura could not simply walk away from 24 years of payments because Mark had decided to rent somewhere else. In the end, keeping the house was not financially sensible for either of them. It was sold. Laura grieved when she packed the rooms. That house had held Sophie's childhood. Birthday dinners, Christmas mornings, school projects spread across the table. Arguments that once seemed important, and ordinary evenings she had assumed would continue forever. There was no satisfaction in closing the door for the last time. Only acceptance. The equity was divided fairly. Retirement assets were handled through the proper process, and their final agreement, the money Mark had tried to keep outside the clearest view, was included in the financial picture. The final parenting schedule gave Mark meaningful time with Sophie, but it also respected his travel demands and the caregiving pattern that had existed long before the divorce. It was not the exact 50-50 arrangement he had demanded. It was a schedule Sophie could depend on. Child support was based on a fuller account of what Mark actually earned, not merely the salary figure he preferred to discuss. Laura did not get everything she asked for. Mark did not lose everything he owned. Real divorce rarely ends with one person walking away victorious while the other stands in ruins. The result was quieter than that. The truth limited Mark's ability to rewrite the marriage. That was enough. For a while, Mark continued seeing Rebecca. Once her own divorce moved forward, she began spending more time at the condo. Mark told friends the two of them had finally found their way back to each other. He spoke as though 24 years with Laura had been a long interruption between two people who had always belonged together. Maybe he believed that. People often believe the version of the story that makes their choices easier to live with. For a few months, the relationship seemed to work. Then the ordinary parts began. Custody weekends had to be respected. Legal meetings interrupted plans. Money was tighter than Mark had expected. There were arguments about the condo, the furniture, the bills, and how much of their future had been financed before Rebecca had even agreed to it. Nostalgia had felt powerful in a coastal town. It felt different when it had to survive grocery shopping, work stress, support payments, and resentment. Rebecca had known the younger Mark. Now she was living with the older one. The man who had described Laura as the reason he felt trapped still felt trapped after Laura was gone. He blamed the attorneys. He blamed the financial settlement. He blamed the custody schedule. He blamed the timing of Rebecca's divorce. He blamed the pressure. What he did not do was take full responsibility. Rebecca began to understand something Laura had learned slowly. Mark did not only need love. He needed someone to confirm that his choices were reasonable. When Laura stopped doing that, he turned to Rebecca. When Rebecca stopped doing it, their old connection began to crack. The relationship did not end with a public scandal. There was no dramatic confrontation. Rebecca simply stopped spending as much time at the condo. Then she stopped staying overnight. Eventually, mutual friends heard they had separated. The same patterns Mark had carried out of his marriage had followed him into the relationship he believed would save him. That was his karma. Not poverty. Not humiliation. not some impossible punishment. He had to live inside the life he had chosen after the excitement of choosing it was gone. 1 year after the divorce, Laura lived in a townhouse across town. It was smaller than the family home. The kitchen had less counter space. There was no formal dining room. Sophie's bedroom was close enough that Laura could hear music through the wall when her daughter forgot how thin it was. It was not the life Laura had imagined for herself at 52, but it was peaceful, and every part of it felt honest. Sophie's parenting calendar was attached to the refrigerator with 2 magnets. School nights. Weekends with Mark. Appointments. Holidays. Everything was clear. There were no last-minute arguments delivered through her. No questions about which parent she loved more. No pressure to repair a marriage she had not broken. The bills arrived in Laura's name. She paid them from an account that belonged to her. At first, that frightened her. Then it began to feel like freedom. At work, Laura took on more responsibility after a senior administrator retired. She had spent years underestimating how much she could handle because so much of her energy had gone into keeping the household stable. Her employer noticed what Mark had stopped seeing. She was organized, reliable, calm under pressure. The promotion came with better pay and more authority. It did not make Laura wealthy. It gave her breathing room. That was more valuable. The biggest change was sleep. Laura no longer woke at 2 a.m. and looked across the bed to see whether Mark was holding his phone. She no longer listened for the small sound of a device being turned face down. She did not wonder which version of the truth she would hear the next day. The townhouse was smaller, but the silence inside it was peaceful, not suspicious. Several months later, Laura met Daniel. He was introduced through a colleague from work. There was nothing dramatic about the beginning. No instant declarations. No promises made over one dinner. No speeches about destiny. Daniel was patient. He listened when Laura spoke. He remembered small things without making a performance of it. He understood that Sophie came first, and never acted as though Laura's responsibilities were an inconvenience. When Laura needed space, he respected it. When she asked a difficult question, he answered. That difference took time for Laura to trust. She had become used to questions turning into arguments. With Daniel, a question was simply a question. There was no punishment for asking it. He did not try to rescue Laura from her past. He did not tell her she should be grateful he was willing to date a divorced woman in her 50s. He treated her like an equal. For the first time in years, Laura began to understand that love did not have to leave a person feeling replaceable. Sophie noticed the change before Laura spoke about it. Daniel did not try to become her father. He did not compete with Mark or ask Sophie to approve of him. He was simply respectful. He asked about school, helped carry groceries, fixed a loose cabinet door after asking Laura whether she wanted help. More importantly, he treated Laura with patience when no one else was watching. Sophie saw that. It was enough. By then, Mark and Rebecca had ended their relationship. A few months after the breakup, Mark sent Laura a long message. He said he had finally understood what he had done. He admitted he had confused nostalgia with love. He wrote that he had destroyed the most stable and meaningful relationship of his life. He said he had spent months thinking about the house, their marriage, and the family he had taken for granted. Then he asked whether Laura would meet him, just once. He said he did not expect anything. People often say that when they are hoping for everything. Laura read the message from beginning to end. There was a time when those words would have mattered to her. There was a time when she would have needed Mark to admit she had been right. She would have wanted him to understand the damage, recognize what he had lost, and say clearly that Rebecca had never been worth the cost. Now, the message felt like something from an old life. Laura closed her phone. She did not answer. It was not punishment. She no longer needed Mark's regret to validate her decision. A week later, Mark sent Sophie a message. He asked whether she could convince her mother to meet him. That was the first time Sophie saw clearly that Mark still wanted other people to manage the consequences of his choices. She read the message. Then she set her phone aside. She did not answer either. Laura had never told Sophie to ignore her father. She still encouraged their scheduled time together. She never asked her daughter to take sides. But Sophie would not carry Mark's request into Laura's new life. Neither woman wanted revenge. They had simply stopped carrying his regret for him. That was a burden he would have to hold himself. The question Laura asked in the kitchen had not saved her marriage. It had done something more important. It had saved her from spending the rest of her life waiting to be chosen by a man who had already treated her as a backup plan. Mark had gone looking for closure with the woman from his past. Laura found closure by looking directly at the man standing in front of her and accepting the answer he could not say aloud. He had come home because Rebecca had not chosen him yet. Laura left because, after 24 years of choosing her husband, her daughter, and the life they had built, she finally chose herself. And when better love eventually found her, it did not ask her to compete with a memory. It did not make her prove she was worth staying for. It simply stayed. If you believe betrayal leaves evidence, but peace begins when someone finally takes back their power, subscribe for more stories about divorce, custody, consequences, and redemption.